Good day, everyone, and welcome to your lecture review on our feminist option for the Victorian novel, Jane Eyre. My love, my darling, my heart. I have to admit, I really struggled at first to know what ought to go into this review lecture on Jane Eyre. It's an incredibly intricate, complex book with an almost endless number of valuable features that we could talk about. Which is true of many sources on our course list for this term, but most of those sources aren't as long as Jane Eyre, so the stakes of the question are a bit different. The theology of this book in particular, which I know is a subject of relevance to all of us, is just incredibly rich. In places, it's very clear and succinct, while in other places, really obviously unresolved, kind of left in a state of almost live negotiation for Jane, that just never ceases to be enthralling, at least for me as a reader. And I think it could be a reasonable candidate for one of the first psychological novels in English. I think its Gothic quality probably poses some barriers to its winning that label, but it makes a strong case. It's a psychologically sophisticated book, which paired with its feminism and its central female protagonist makes it kind of a standout work in Victorian literature. Again, on the subject of faith, at times the novel's Christianity appears to be highly conventional to its time, and then at other moments it's shockingly beautifully rebellious, and that won it a lot of criticism in its time. The character of Helen Burns, particularly, is one of my favorite characters in the book, because of the way that she seems to embody and harmonize both conventional aspects of a traditional Protestant Christian worldview for this time, together with some really contentious ideas, like most particularly her universalism. She talks about harboring this private belief that everyone goes to God in the end. And, you know, the terms that she puts it in, you could easily miss it, but she basically says she doesn't believe anybody ever goes to hell, which for the Victorian period and for a really classically sort of fire and brimstone Protestant culture like the one this novel and Charlotte Bronte herself quite clearly came out of, that's a big statement. As a Bildungsroman, a novel of personal development, Jane Eyre is intensely spiritual. It is intensely female, and I find those things quite rare, and especially the spiritual side. The female now today not so rare, but for its time, those qualities make it a really rare and rewarding read. But I'm digressing a bit, which really only serves to illustrate the point that I started with. I think what I found particularly difficult in prepping this review lecture was knowing exactly where to start in trying to unpack the coremost elements of the novel for you all. One of the benefits of Zoom classes or the drop-in sessions that we're going to be having on Mondays going forward is that I can ask you guys how you felt about the novel, what stood out to you, what specific questions you have, and that way I can kind of gauge the temperature. I can gauge what was clear to you just by reading the book and what needs a finer elucidation. So absent those cues, I think what I'll just say is that the SparkNotes material on Jane Eyre is really excellent. Not every SparkNotes study guide on every text seems equally valuable to me, although in general they're good and reliable. But if you're looking for a way to check your basic grasp of the themes, devices, significance, the overall messages or questions that this novel puts forward for you as a reader to chew on, hit that SparkNotes study guide and really take your time with it. Look at the full book analysis under the summary tab. Look at the literary devices tab for sure, and definitely take some time with the quotes tab. The quotes tab offers key quotations from the novel unpacked And that resource allows you to explore those key quotes organized either by character or by theme or by chapter. So it's really useful that way. It's got good organization. It's something that I go to myself when trying to refresh my memory for teaching prep, things like that. So, having commended you to these valuable resources available from our friends at SparkNotes, I'd like to talk a little bit about one key theme or feature that stands out to me as being significant in Jane Eyre in this first half of the video. This is going to be a two-parter, and in this first half I'd like to work on a key theme in Jane Eyre that I think sometimes doesn't get a lot of discussion in conventional summaries or analyses of the book, and that is this book's persistent tendency to appeal to the reader's spiritual instincts. There is a gut-level, emotional, instinctive, a faculty for sensation that Charlotte Bronte and that this novel clearly believe exists in people, and this book appeals to that faculty at least as much as it appeals to our basic intellectual faculties as readers. In my reading of Jane Eyre, I find that Jane, and there are two Janes here. There's the Jane in the story, who's living her experiences in real time as they happen to her, and then there's Jane the narrator, the mature, reflective, self-actualized woman who is relating her story to us in the past tense. And here in this next point, I'm talking about the Jane that is both of those women. In my reading of the novel, I find that both of those Janes, whose voices and thoughts make up the text, are constantly offering themselves and their thoughts and her experiences up to us in this really naked kind of a way. It's not that she doesn't wax philosophical and really try to forcefully bring across the rationality of her points, but that there are these moments when all of that just falls away, and usually there are a lot of dashes or very short sentences in these moments that signify kind of a fragmentation. She's sort of losing her ability to filter her raw experience and translate it into language, or she's giving up the attempt. But there are these moments where it all just falls away, and she presents her thoughts and feelings and experiences as simply and honestly as she can, either to be understood and really grasped and empathized with by the reader, or not. She puts herself, her vivid, living, inexplicable, spiritual self kind of in our hands, live and raw like that. She is playing out the natural music of her soul and simply waiting and hoping for it to find a resonance, a harmony, a natural sympathy, which is a phrase we'll come back to, in the breast of another person. That is a theme and an approach in this book. It's reflected in numerous quotes. This theme that I would almost call almost like an Advent theme, like, the season of Advent before Christmas, this sort of, it's a bit of a fasting time, a bit bleak, this kind of watching and waiting as the days get darker and shorter and colder. It's this waiting for the Messiah. This tendency in Jane Eyre seems to me almost like an Advent theme of the voice of one crying in the wilderness, deep calling to deep, awaiting some kind of spiritual reply or a divine echo to finally come to her, whether from a human companion, which would be surprising and pivotal, or from the ministering Spirit of God directly in those moments when she most needs that stabilizing and sustaining connection. To offer a few quotes where this is sort of illustrated, think about Rochester's, and I should say, Jane is not the only person who seems to display these feelings or tendencies or desires in the novel. We see that Rochester shares kind of this idea that there is a natural harmony that can exist between people that is rare and precious and to be waited for and to be seized when you find it. And that's that shared belief or shared attitude, that kindredness or sympathy is one of the cues that, Jane and Rochester may really belong together. But he has this involuntary sort of gush of confidence to Jane in the scene right after she first saves him from the fire in his room. He says, I knew, he continued, you would do me good in some way at some time. I saw it in your eyes when I first beheld you. Their expression and smile did not. Again he stopped. He proceeded hastily. Did not strike delight to my very inmost heart so for nothing. People talk of natural sympathies, and I have heard of good genii. There are grains of truth in the wildest fable. My cherished preserver, good night. You can see in the dashes and ellipses and fragmentation in this paragraph that he's not fully in his intellectual faculties here. He's trying to give words to a raw, spiritual sense of truth, right? And he's talking about natural sympathies, natural kindredness of spirit between people. Later, again, when Jane believes that Rochester is going to marry Blanche Ingram and she announces that she plans to depart to find a new situation in Ireland, he says this to her. I sometimes have a queer feeling with regard to you, especially when you are near me, as now. It's as if I had a string somewhere under my left ribs, tightly and inextricably knotted to a similar string, situated in the corresponding quarter of your little frame. And if that boisterous channel, meaning the English Channel, and 200 miles or so of land came broad between us, I am afraid that cord of communion would be snapped. And then I have a nervous notion I should take to bleeding inwardly. There is a bond of spiritual connection that he feels that is so intense, so palpable, that he almost feels like separation could cause some kind of psychosomatic or physical injury. Much like Great Expectations, this novel is very much about efforts to transcend the barriers of class division. One difference, though, is that in Great Expectations, Pip attempts to surmount these barriers by playing the social status game and winning or trying to win. But in Jane Eyre, Jane strives to transcend these barriers of class, sex, race, and all other false human constructs simply by denouncing them and waiting for a spiritual equal to answer her challenge, to take up that quest of rejection with her. This is a novel in which the equality of essential persons, of spirits, is believed and asserted to transcend material or socio-political barriers. It's a novel in which spiritual bonds manifest actually in the natural realm. Nature itself will testify in this novel to what is most essentially true. And this is exemplified in situations like when lightning strikes the chestnut tree, where Jane and Rochester pledge love to each other, sort of symbolizing and declaring and foreshadowing the presence of an insuperable barrier, namely Rochester's deception as regarding his wife Bertha. And I should say that's a great example of nature manifesting a spiritual truth. Rochester's marriage may seem like it's only a legal technicality, but this novel really does assert that there's an underlying spiritual reality to his bond to Bertha, the impossibility of his being equally yoked with Jane while that relationship, that obligation still exists. There is an essential or an existential truth to that reality which cannot be obscured by any, pleading about how superficial the marriage is or whether marriage is simply a legal or social construct. Another example of nature manifesting these spiritual truths to testify to what people feel as spiritual yet embodied beings, people who are both earth and fire at the same time, is when Jane has her experience of what we might call ESP, or extrasensory perception, when she literally hears Rochester's spirit calling to her in a moment of crisis. This is, after she's sort of just got done rejecting St. John's proposal of marriage. And on this theme, of spiritual equality, of sort of nature testifying to spiritual truths, of spiritual immanence in humans' embodied natural lives. On this theme, I always think most poignantly of Jane's speech from chapter 23. Again, when she's saying, you're going to marry Blanche, I have to leave. She says, "I tell you I must go," I retorted, roused to something like passion. "Do you think that I can stay to become nothing to you? Do you think I am an automaton, a machine without feelings, and can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips, my drop of living water dashed from my cup? Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little that I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. I am not talking to you through the medium of custom, conventionalities, nor even mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both of us had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet equal as we are." At which point Rochester very sexily replies, "As we are," and he later calls her, my equal, my image. And it's, mwah. I mean, how do you not love that? But, always there's a but. In this quest for the triumph of spiritual equality, Jane is pitted over and over again against the very real and formidable problems of systemic, socially and politically entrenched inequalities, most particularly money and patriarchy. And those two are sort of commingled, of course. But these worldly realities, socio-political, material realities, are like webs in which Jane finds herself and those around her, including Rochester and Bertha Mason, inextricably entangled. And so the whole novel is kind of them striving to find ways to free themselves from those nets. And here, on this point, is where I would like to pivot our attention to the character of Bertha Mason more fully, leading into part 2, because she is critical to this novel at every possible layer of understanding. So, grab yourself a top-up on whatever you're sipping and click over to part 2. But I should first just mention, before I forget, having spent some time discussing the spiritual and religious qualities and themes of this novel, I have posted in the Files tab a quick list of some reflection or discussion questions that revolve specifically around religion in this novel. So if that's something you'd like to spend more time thinking about and really parsing through to see how this novel as a Bildungsroman, a spiritual Bildungsroman or novel of formation, plays itself out, how religion and faith treatments evolve in this story, do head on over to the Files tab for this week and have a look at those discussion questions. But, as I said, refresh your beverage, and I'll see you in part 2.